Everyone, welcome to the second meeting in 2020 of the Finance and Constitution Committee. We have apologies this morning from our convener, Bruce Crawford. We wish him well. He'll be back with us soon. Our first item on our agenda this morning is to take evidence on the strategic context of the Scottish Government's budget for 2020-2021 with the Fraser of Allender Institute, who published their annual report in November. And we have in front of us Mary Spowage, the Deputy Director of the Fraser of Allender Institute. Welcome to the meeting. And I understand you want to make a few opening remarks to set the conversation in context.
Yes,
thank you very much.
And thanks very much for inviting me to speak today about the context of the budget next week. So our report from November was our fourth annual budget report. It was prepared, obviously, in November before the election took place, but I think pretty much all of the analysis within it remains valid, given the outcome of the election, to set the overall context for the Scottish budget. In the report, we did a bit of a look back on the budgets that had happened over the period of this Parliament. And it's fair to say that the fiscal context, as with many other things, has changed fairly dramatically since 2016. Back then, our outlook was for a significant period of belt tightening as the UK government sought to bring down its deficit and stock of debt. But now it would appear we're in a period of increasing spending, particularly in following the announcements in the spending round in September. What else has happened since then? Well, significant new powers have been devolved to the Scottish Parliament over this period, and these powers have been used fairly extensively to change taxation in Scotland. The practical implications of the agreed fiscal framework are beginning to be realised, with real budgetary implications for the Scottish budget. During that period, there's obviously been significant political and economic uncertainty, dominated by the debate over the UK's departure from the EU. So what does this mean for the year to come? Well, our outlook for the block grant, in line with the announcements that were made in September, is that for the resource block grant, is it will grow around 2.1% in 2021, and probably, given what we know now, a similar amount the year after. This is fairly healthy in the context of recent years, and certainly compared to the outlook we had back at the beginning of the Parliament. But this is, of course, before the UK budget in March, and is based on the September announcements. So there is some uncertainty to these figures, of course. However, some of the positivity and the outlook for the resource block grant could be, and probably will be, offset by negative income tax reconciliations. I confirmed around £200 million in the budget that we're going to have next week, and a potentially much larger reconciliation coming down the road for the 21-22 budget. So this may mean that the resource block grant grows by more like, overall, at the end of the day, by less than 1% in real terms over these years. But it all depends on the numbers that are coming over the next few weeks. For example, there are some signs that wage growth in Scotland has improved from the previous outlook. So it may be that the reconciliation for 21-22 is not as large as currently estimated. But as you know, there are many movable parts that make this uncertain. We will know more next week when the forecasts are updated by the Scottish Fiscal Commission, and we'll have the final answer on the reconciliation when the outturn data are published in the summer. Importantly, we reach a very important landmark for the devolution of the Scotland Act 2016 powers in April 2020, when financial responsibility for the majority of the social security powers are transferred to the Scottish Parliament. This means that the budget in 2021 and beyond will be exposed to new risks, as well as obviously new opportunities for these powers. This is a mirror image to the risks around tax. There are both the risks that spending on benefits per head grows more quickly in Scotland than in England and Wales. And additionally, there's the risk, of course, of forecast error, which could happen on both sides of the equation by both the OBR and the Fiscal Commission. We have the complexity this year of the Scottish budget taking place before the UK budget, in the wake of a year of various types of uncertainty. This is clearly a sort of suboptimal situation for the Scottish Government and yourselves in terms of the constrained time for scrutiny and the uncertainty over the budget situation. we've done quite a lot of thinking about the risks that all of this brings in terms of the sequencing of the budgets, if this is an area you're keen to sort of talk about more in the session. So I'm happy to stop now and invite questions.
Mary, that's very helpful, thank you. And you've raised a number of issues that I know members will want to explore in greater depth with you. Can I start with this question of sequencing that you just finished on? On page 35 of your report, you state that there is unprecedented certainty around a number of elements which inform the Scottish budget, and that in normal time the UK budget would precede the Scottish budget. Is it not the case, however, that when the fiscal framework was agreed between the UK and Scottish governments back in February 2016, that the UK budget was then published annually in March, so that it was drafted, the fiscal framework that is, was drafted on the basis that the Scottish budget would normally be passed before the UK budget. If that understanding is correct, is it not the case that the fiscal framework was designed precisely to deal with the UK budget being published after and not before the Scottish budget? Or have I misunderstood that?
No, you're correct that when the fiscal framework was agreed, that was the case. It was the autumn statement and the March budget. So that there are a number of different movable parts and the risks around the UK budget coming after the Scottish budget. And some of them are a function of what's happened over the last year, and some of them are about the UK budget actually coming after the Scottish budget, and they are sort of separate things. When the fiscal framework was set, it was envisaged that the block grant adjustments would be set at the time of the autumn statement, even if the budget wasn't until March. So the different sorts of risks that come for the Scottish budget in the current situation, the BGAs would have been set at the autumn statement. So that would have been known to the Scottish Government in terms of what the BGAs would be, which would actually impact on the budgetary year. Obviously, there would be reconciliations down the road, potentially, but that would have been certain. What wouldn't have been certain is there would have been the potential for UK policy announcements at the March budget and other announcements which could have changed the block grant. So yes, those were risks that were present at the time of the agreement of the fiscal framework. So yes, you're correct.
So this is, I mean, the process this year is obviously different from the process that we've gone through in each of the last 2 or 3 years. But we need to be careful a bit not to exaggerate the completely unprecedented nature of the process that we're in at the moment.
Yes, I guess it has been, this is an unusual situation based on our experience of the last few years when these tax powers have actually been in place and have been used. I mean, if you will, do you mind if I go through the different sources of uncertainty that this situation
I think it would be helpful,
brings
thank you.
us? So there are a number of movable parts, as we all know now, that make up the Scottish budget. So the first area of uncertainty is the block grant itself. Given the return of the Conservative government and Sajid Javid as the Chancellor, following the spending announcements he made in September, it seems likely that the broad envelope of the Scottish block grant is known with a fair degree of certainty. It might be that there are further spending announcements, of course, and tweaks to departmental spending, but it seems less likely to us that the announcements at the budget will lead to a smaller increase in the block grant than was announced in September. So on the block grant, it seems like there's limited downside risk for the Scottish budget. The block grant adjustments, obviously provisional block grant adjustments have been provided to be used for the Scottish budget. And these were updated by the OBR prior to Christmas for outturn data, but importantly, they weren't updated to reflect new economic forecasts because the OBR haven't produced any since March last year. So what are the risks if these are used? Leaving aside any UK government policy changes, which is something that I need to come back to, there is a risk that the OBR could change their view on wage growth in the rest of the UK. Given the narrative that they've had, I think that the risk of significant change is not very high. But small changes in these assumptions can lead to large changes in cash terms, in terms of the forecast of the block grant adjustments. In addition, they could have a different view than they've had last March on the outlook for social security benefits in terms of new additions to the caseload or other things. You know, benefits like personal independence payments are still fairly new, and entries to the caseload can be fairly volatile. So one could say if these are used to fix the budget, you know, when they're sort of locked in, that the chance of larger reconciliations down the road than would have otherwise been the case is possible. But obviously these could be in either direction. Obviously, Derek Mackay has asked for the flexibility to use the updated versions of the block grant adjustments in the event that these are beneficial to the Scottish budget envelope, but is still awaiting a reply, as I understand, from the Chief Secretary to the Treasury. The final, one of the final risks I want to talk about is UK policy change. This is potentially more significant issue for the Scottish budget and the Scottish Government, although it might be more for sort of policy and political reasons than sort of immediate fiscal consequences. So if there is a UK policy change on income tax or stamp duty, for example, then the use of these locked-in BGAs would mean that these wouldn't, you know, there wouldn't be an effect on the budget they were about to set. But it does increase the risk of these provisional BGAs being a poor estimate of the ultimate BGAs that are used in any reconciliation. So essentially it kicks the can down the road in terms of dealing with that. But it would give the government time to plan to deal with those. However, there is a sort of political or policy risk that UK policy announcements in some way make the Scottish government's policies look in some way unsustainable or unviable by comparison. Overall, though, it's quite difficult to see, given the fiscal rules that they've announced so far, based on the details we have, how large tax cuts, for example, are actually going to be offered. But we just don't know until the UK budget is unveiled.
The key point is that, you know, if the biggest risk is attendant on UK budget changes, then those UK budget changes would always have been announced at the budget, which, when the fiscal framework was drafted, was in March after the Scottish budget. So that's factored in, isn't it, to the way in which the fiscal framework was designed to operate. Whether it's operating as designed is a different question, but it's factored into the way in which the UK budget was designed to operate.
At the time of the agreement of the fiscal framework, yes, although I think generally it was welcomed when the budget was moved to autumn in order for there to be more certainty and more time. Whether this was the motivation or not, the sort of respect for example, the Scottish Parliament's budget process to be able to happen in an orderly fashion, you know, I think it would be a bit of a step backwards, you know, to go back to the March situation. I don't think anyone would argue with that. So, and that, you know, I think in a way it would sort of cause tension potentially between the two governments in terms of respect for the budget process here. That's
very helpful introduction. Thank you very much. Angela, do you want to take this further forward?
A few questions, thank you. Good morning. I think we all appreciate that there are always risks as well as opportunities, but I just wonder if you could make a more evaluative statement about the cumulative risks to the Scottish budget taking place before the UK budget. In particular, you know, the cumulative impact given the use of block grant adjustments, which you've said are normally set in autumn, you know, layer on top of that the risk around BGA being calculated without updated economic forecasts, and you've already touched upon the impact of unknown knowledge around UK government tax policy, given, as you've said, that small changes can indeed lead to large cash changes.
It's kind of difficult to do an overall assessment of the risk. You know, as we've gone through the different elements, the risk seems sort of low to moderate for each of them. But if lots of different things were to come to pass, obviously it could look quite different from what we're expecting. Our view is that the chances of change the block grant in the downward direction are fairly low. That really the risk of UK government policy announcements at the budget in March in devolved tax areas is fairly low. And if the provisional BJs are locked in, then even if they are significantly different from either the BJs after March the 11th or the BJs in a year's time or 2 years' time when we're talking about income tax, you know, there is time to deal with that and to manage that risk. So I think our point, and we wrote a blog on this detailing all of our thoughts, but was that, yes, it does create additional uncertainty. And picking up on the point about it being not dissimilar to the situation when the fiscal framework was agreed, there are two elements that make it more uncertain than that situation. Because we haven't had a forecast from the OBR in a year, that is quite an unprecedented situation. So in terms of how their thoughts have evolved over that period, you know, it does make it quite uncertain where they're going to land on things like social security payments. I think overall, we don't think that the risks are as great as some are making out. But it's certainly a suboptimal situation to be in, particularly given the constrained period for scrutiny that you know, the Parliament now has.
Okay, given that there is a well-known potential volatility in the Scottish budget, and other colleagues will come on to talk about social security, I wondered whether you thought that, on balance, whether that volatility was or is exacerbated by the late UK budget, and also whether you think the things like whether the reserve and borrowing limits under the fiscal framework, whether they're adequate for a budget of this size.
Well, in terms of the budget that we're about to set next week, if the BJs are locked in and you know, the block grant is as we expect, then it is possible to plan based on the announcements in September fairly well for the next couple of years. So I'm not sure that the late UK budget is bringing volatility into the Scottish budget envelope necessarily. But if there are unexpected spending announcements in March, obviously there is an argument for that, given that it will affect the BJs significantly. It could affect the BJs significantly, which will lead to reconciliations which are larger than maybe would have been the case if they had been set in the autumn. In terms of your other question about the borrowing limits that were set out in the fiscal framework, I think given the perfectly reasonable and expected errors that may come through forecasts of a tax as big as income tax, if you look at the OBR's forecasting performance on it, you know, errors of 2 to 3% are generally accepted as being, you know, a good performance. You know, if you take that for an £11 billion tax, and you accept that that could happen both in the Scottish forecast and in the forecast of the BGA, potentially in different directions, then the provisions within the fiscal framework do start to look you know, a little small, given that these are the risks that we're potentially managing in Scotland. Add to that the fact that these powers are going to have to be used to manage the risks around social security payments. And these can be much more tricky to forecast than tax take can be, particularly if they are devolved policy changes, the method for assessment changes. Now, I know these things will be happening gradually over a period of time, but with each of these changes, assessing what that will mean for take-up and therefore expenditure is a challenging thing to do, because you have limited evidence with which to base assumptions on about how these might influence caseload and therefore expenditure in the future.
Thank you. My final point is, given that the fiscal framework is due to be renegotiated in 2022, do you have any views about what the outcome of that renegotiation should be?
Okay. Well, obviously that's for the two governments to decide. I think, though, what has become clear in the practical workings of the fiscal framework is that it is very complex. I've done enough talks on block grant adjustments to know that it's pretty difficult for people to wrap their head around. Once we start adding in social security in earnest, along with the different sorts of reconciliations that will happen with social security as versus the taxes, it's understandable that a lot of people in the Parliament and in the wider public might have difficulty engaging with how our budget's actually determined in Scotland. That said, all of these decisions about exactly how these things are worked out were made for good reasons. And it can be difficult sometimes to see what the alternative would be. So there's definitely an issue about complexity and wider understanding of the fiscal framework. And it's certainly the case that any expectation that forecast errors will be smaller in the future than they have been is not reasonable in my view. Therefore, these sorts of forecast errors are perfectly within the range of what should be expected. And it does seem that the Parliament should have some sort of mechanism to deal with these sorts of forecast errors if this is the mechanisms we're going to use going forward.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Gordon.
Thanks very much. I was wanting to ask you about what you think Scotland's outlook on its economy and the fiscal outlook looks, bearing in mind we've got Brexit round the corner, 31st of January, end of this week. Although the transition period is not to the 31st, I'm thinking in terms of we've not yet got a trade agreement in place. We don't know how long that's going to take. There's freedom of movement, access to EU workers, and the impact on tourism. What impact could that have on the Scottish budget?
Yes, so there are a number of uncertainties about the outlook. We've seen that there's definitely been an uptick in confidence since there was some short-term sort of certainty around the fact that we were now going to leave the EU at the end of this week. But the businesses are now worried about, so what next? What happens at the end of the year, and what will that mean for my trading position? So yes, there are a number of areas of uncertainty for the Scottish budget. We have a real challenge in Scotland on the demographic outlook, for example. We know that the outlook for Scotland in terms of our ageing population is very different to England. And therefore we have perhaps different needs when it comes to the amount of people coming into Scotland. We've never had as high migration flows into Scotland as England has. And that's shown in the outlook for the Scottish population, which in terms of the working age population is sort of forecast to start falling. This has serious implications for our tax take in Scotland. If more of our population becomes not of working age and not paying income tax, for example, then obviously our tax base will get smaller, and that has implications for the Scottish budget. So yes, these are all risks and uncertainties about the future. And
does the fiscal framework provide any kind of support or safety net or anything if that was to pass?
So the fiscal framework protects against overall population risk. So both in terms of on the social security side and the tax side. So the important thing for us is, do tax receipts per capita grow at the same rate as the equivalent taxes in the rest of the UK, which depending on the tax or social security payment, sometimes England and Wales, sometimes England and Northern Ireland, it depends. So per head, if we grow more quickly than the rest of the UK, then the budget will be better off, and the opposite is true. However, if less of our population, so per taxpayer, if less of our population is paying tax, then obviously, and less of our and more of our population is not paying tax, then that risk is not protected from. And similarly on social security payments, if we have more of our population being older, and some of these benefits that are being devolved are linked to things like disability, which can be increased in older age, then it could be that the per capita payments are higher than England and Wales, which again, we are not protected from the risk of that happening. That will be one of the consequences of the devolution of these benefits.
I've got another question about social security, but before we come to that, you said in page 2 of your 2019 budget report, the potential for radical Brexit tax proposals cast a shadow over the forthcoming Scottish budget. What did you mean by that?
So that was a chapter that was written by our colleagues in ICAS. I think that what Charlotte Barber was referring to was potential for significant changes to income tax and the divergence that would create, the greater divergence that would create between UK and Scottish tax policy, and would further exacerbate this additional issue of the national insurance threshold rising with the higher rate threshold and at the rest of the UK rate, which would create this larger portion of the Scottish taxpayer population that were paying a marginal rate of tax of 53%.
Moving on to the social security that we've touched upon already, again in your budget report you said the newly transferred social security benefits, not knowing how much its grant will, the BGA forecasts have not been published, and not knowing how much its grant will increase to fund this expenditure is a real problem for the Scottish Government. Could you expand on that as well, please?
Well, yes, at the time we didn't have those figures. We now have provisional figures for the block grant adjustments for social security. Based on the forecasts that the Scottish Fiscal Commission most recently provided, it does look like pretty much the block grant adjustments, so the addition to the budget, will be more or less the same as the forecast for these expenditures in 2021. As I say, these are based on the provisional figures. If these are used and locked in, then you have some certainty over 2021, and the fact that the block grant adjustment will cover the forecasted expenditure on these. But that is a forecast for expenditure, and we don't know what the expenditure will actually be in the year.
Given the difficulties we had with the forecasting of income tax prior to the devolution of those powers, are you sure that the forecasting for social security is fairly accurate?
Well, one thing I would say about the forecasting of income tax is that we did not have figures for how much income tax was raised on an administrative basis in Scotland prior to the figures being published in the summer of 2018. So the survey of personal incomes was used, and obviously what we've discovered subsequently is that method had overestimated the tax base in Scotland, particularly at the higher end. We're not in that situation on social security. We do know how many people in Scotland are paid these, absolutely administrative data. We know how many people receive these payments in Scotland. So we know what the base is, the starting point, if you like, and we absolutely know that with certainty. The greater uncertainty for social security is probably forecasting forward. So it's about policy changes. So if you change your approach, you're encouraging take-up. An assessment process is perhaps less stringent or rigorous. They do a lot of campaigns. These sorts of things are quite intangible in terms of quantifying the impact they may have on take-up. But if they do increase take-up of benefits that people are eligible for, or eligibility is changed or made more generous, then these will have impacts for spending on social security payments. That's more difficult with social security than it is on tax, where you've got probably a greater evidence base for how tax changes may lead to changes in tax paid.
What's the slight puzzle about this, though, is not the comparison with social security to tax, but the comparison of social security to other demand-led public services, and the health service is demand-led. But we don't seem to have the same anxieties. Maybe we should, but we don't seem to have the same anxieties about forecasting health spending as we currently seem to have about forecasting social security spending. So what's different about social security spending that makes it more risky for the Scottish Government than the health budget?
I suppose because it is purely demand-led, and we will spend what we spend on it. So there won't be a budget set which we will then work to. These eligibility criteria will be in place, and people who apply and are successful will be paid this money. So the forecasts of this demand-led expenditure are more risky because it could mean that we spend a lot more than that in any one year.
Different from the health service?
Because our budget's set for them. So.
Okay. Murdo, I think you had some questions about something else.
Yes, thank you. I've got some questions about the block grant adjustment, but just before I come to that, I wanted to ask a follow-up to Gordon MacDonald's earlier questions around the economy and the impact of the economy on tax receipts. Because last week we had the employment and unemployment figures came out, which showed that Scottish unemployment and UK unemployment, I think, are now at the same rate, but the Scottish employment rate is 2% below the UK average, and there was a comment from Fraser of Allender that went along with that, suggesting this was the highest gap in 2 decades. And I'm interested in the impact that has on tax revenues, because presumably if the Scottish employment rate would rise to at least the UK average, that would have a very beneficial impact on overall tax revenues, and therefore the Scottish budget.
Potentially, yes, and in making judgments about the forecast of total tax take, obviously the Fiscal Commission will look at trends in employment and unemployment and earnings. Crucially, it's how that employment actually sort of translates into tax take. There's a large proportion of people in Scotland who are lifted out of income tax altogether. So it does depend on how those jobs, and that will be based on the patterns that we have from historic data on the wage distribution in Scotland and how employment then translates into tax take. So yes, in principle, higher employment would lead to higher tax take, but it does depend on the wage distribution of those employees in terms of how that benefits the tax take.
Okay, thank you. I've got 2 questions on the block grant adjustment. You said in your opening remarks that you expected the block grant from the UK government to grow by 2.1% in real terms from this year to next. But you then went on to say that because of the block grant adjustment, because of the forecast for tax revenues, in fact, the growth would be down to 1%. So are you in effect saying that more than half of the benefit of the block grant increase will be lost because of a slower growth in devolved tax revenues? And if that's the case, how does that translate in cash terms?
Okay. So in effect, what we're saying is the combined effect of 2 things are, meaning that the difference between the block grant and the sort of the net position after you take account of the taxes is, so once you take account of the both the fact that income tax will not be contributing as much to growth in the overall Scottish budget envelope as it has in previous years, and that's because of the weaker outlook for wage growth from the Scottish Fiscal Commission in their most recent set of forecasts, but also when you take account of the reconciliation that will come as part of the 2021 budget. When you combine those overall things together, then those are the things that sort of take away it down to 1%. But there are significant uncertainties. Obviously, the reconciliation is about £200 million. There are other uncertainties that can feed into the overall size of the Scottish budget. There may be further spending announcements. There may be underspends or use of the reserve. So there are other things that could mean that the overall size of the Scottish budget is somewhere between that 1% and 2% level.
Okay, thank you. And my second question around this is that you make comment on your report about the additional income tax the Scottish Government have raised by changing the thresholds and bands, but you also go on to say that there has been an overall decline, relative decline in income tax receipts compared to the rest of the UK, because income tax growth has not been so high in Scotland. So I suppose my question is, would it have been necessary to make these changes to taxes, to thresholds and bands, to raise that extra money, had income tax growth in Scotland matched the UK average?
So the policy changes were made, and at the time they were made, they were forecast to raise additional money, despite any differences between tax growth in the rest of the UK and Scotland. At the moment that these policies were set, it was broadly assumed in the 17-18 budget, for example, that wage growth in Scotland would be the same as the rest of the UK. It has now turned out that that has not come to pass, and therefore there are reconciliations coming. Broadly, when we look forward, the effect of the higher tax rates in Scotland is broadly cancelled out by the fact that the outlook for wage growth in Scotland is slower than the rest of the UK. So I'm not quite answering your question, because it's kind of come the other way around.
I think we've got to the same point, so that's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Patrick, I think you wanted to ask about well-being.
Yeah, can I just follow up on that last point, just to clarify, assuming the economic conditions were unchanged, in other words, that the difference in wage growth that hadn't been expected was still happening, it's fair to say that if the changes to income tax policy hadn't been made, then we would still be in a worse fiscal position. The revenues would be significantly lower than under the previous tax regime.
Yes, absolutely.
And there's no reason, there's no strong evidence to suggest that the changes to tax policy have caused the difference in wage growth.
I wouldn't like to say that there was any evidence of that one way or another. It's very early days in terms of a tax change and evaluating any impact on behaviour or overall wages.
I wanted to move on. Most of the conversation so far has been about the context, the conditions that the Scottish Government is facing. I'd like to ask about what they might be trying to achieve with the budget that they're due to publish next week. The report that you published in November talks a little bit about the Scottish Government's growing interest in a well-being economy, in what that might mean, and it makes some comparisons with the sort of dashboard of indicators in the National Performance Framework from some years back, and the slightly ambiguous definition, some might say a complete lack of definition around what sustainable economic growth means, how it can be broken down, what it actually means in practice. And you raised the possibility that well-being might suffer from the same problem of a lack of definition or not being clear what it means in practice. I wonder if you can unpack that a little bit and say whether you regard this idea of a well-being economy approach as having any positive opportunities, or is it a distraction?
It's certainly true that obviously governments should be about improving the society's well-being. I don't believe any governments are pursuing economic growth, for its own sake, but rather because they see it as a way, for example, to increase the prosperity of their country and the living standards of the people within their country. So it's true that the words that are used around things like the purpose of sustainable economic growth, then focusing on inclusive growth and now a wellbeing economy, are hard to pin down in terms of what they mean for policy making and budgetary decisions, unless there's some more specific outcomes about what that actually means for society and what interventions the government can actually prioritise in order to achieve those. I think we say in our report that otherwise it can just look like window dressing or moving the deck chairs around in order to present budgets in different ways, but without any meaningful change in how actually decisions are made. There's an interesting debate going on right now about how governments can try and make decisions in a way which promotes things like reducing inequality rather than growth. And a lot of this is maybe about how individual policies are evaluated, what's taken into account. And this is happening with things like, the Green Book evaluations and how, infrastructure projects are actually prioritised and where they're done. Are they done where they have the greatest economic multiplier, or are they done where they could have the biggest impact on inequality? And these are decisions that government can actually make to address these problems if they wish to. But I do agree that unless there's more definition about what is meant by prioritising well-being or a well-being economy, and specific and linking that to specific actions and budgets that are going to be spent to actually achieve these aims, it's difficult to see it as being anything other than a bit of a PR exercise. However, we understand that there's plans for, something of a well-being kind of budget or some sort of framing of the budget in that sense. So it'll be interesting to see what that is like. And certainly the document produced by New Zealand in their process is very interesting. But really what they're doing is saying these are the specific things that we want to deal with in order to improve the nation's well-being, and this is the money we're going to spend on these, and these are the outcomes that we want to achieve in these particular things, and they've prioritised particular things in order to achieve that.
Yeah, in a way, it's a very old problem in that things that are easy to measure, like GDP, sometimes tell us less. And there are things that are good for GDP that make poverty and inequality and health impacts worse. And there are things that are bad for GDP that actually improve society in some ways. The opposite's also true, but there's not a simple connection. Do you feel that the approach that New Zealand is taking is worth exploring? Does it require a level of that kind of tangible, measurable specificity? Or is it possible for the concept of a well-being economy to achieve the objective by focusing on things that are perhaps less easily measurable than GDP?
I think the evidence from various incarnations of this idea over the last number of years has been that if there isn't specifics, then it's too difficult to both capture progress and perhaps hold people to account. So I would say that, yes, I think there does need to be that specificity of what it means and what, let's face it, difficult decisions are going to have to be made in order to prioritise things like preventative spend or focus on poverty. By inclusive growth or a well-being budget, we mean we are going to reduce poverty, and that is what we're going to focus on. We've got to remember that New Zealand set their budget in the context of a budget surplus, and they had money to spend on this. And they did focus on new spending rather than a huge rearrangement of their existing budget. So there would be challenges and potentially for the Scottish budget and looking at it like that. But I do think you need those specifics in order to make it meaningful for people.
And finally on this, I know others want to talk about local government in its own right, but maybe just to kind of make the connection between this idea of a well-being economy and local government. Is there a danger that a well-being approach taken by the Scottish Government focuses only on the Scottish Government's fiscal action, the Scottish Government's approach to what is spent by that tier of government, and if cuts are pushed down the chain, with local government expected to decide, whether to protect education and cut other spending more deeply, that the things that harm well-being, the decisions that harm well-being, are made not by the Scottish Government, but the Scottish Government is then able to say the things that we are doing protect well-being. Is there a danger of a disconnect between that sense of objective, what we're trying to achieve, and the level of decision making that's being taken? If those more dangerous or more damaging decisions around cuts are pushed down the chain, if the continued real terms cuts to local government carry on?
I mean, I'd certainly say that, as we say in our report, that local government have borne the brunt of cuts in recent years. We can see from our report that they've protected certain areas, as you say, and basically, therefore, every other area of local government spending has been squeezed hugely, including, things like roads and other sort of civic amenities. And in any dashboard of well-being that I've seen, or societal well-being, or overall, good growth, or any other, things like local community, civic engagement, all of these things are extremely important. Feeling like you will live in a good community, you're participating in local democracy, all of these things are really important for people's well-being. So I suppose, yes, if there isn't a partnership between different layers of government, and I suppose new initiatives like City Deals and these city regional partnerships as well, who are spending a lot of money in different areas of the country to reach the same goals, then you do potentially have...
The City Deal spending has been criticised for not really aligning with long-term strategic priorities as well.
Neil, I think that's the space you want to get into. Do you want to take that up?
Just before I do that, it was interesting what you said about the wellbeing approach being PR exercise, window dressing. Could be seen as. Why do you think that is? Do you think that's an attempt to deflect from weaker economic growth and weaker tax revenues?
Not necessarily. I think it's really difficult. It's really difficult to sort of rethink a whole budget and how different budget lines will contribute to things that are intrinsically harder to measure than how many pounds they add to GVA. It is difficult. This is difficult stuff. It's not easy to draw the line between particular policies and how it impacts on societal well-being all the time. It's not always that easy. So it is difficult stuff to do. I suppose you could make that argument, but that's not what I meant. I think what I meant was this isn't an easy thing to do, and in order to really reshape the budget to focus on things which maybe are more long-term or more preventative in nature, or these sorts of things, you might have to make difficult decisions, which isn't an easy thing to do.
On the issue of City Deals, have you been able to measure the impact City Deals are having on local economies and the Scottish economy, and the impact they have?
No, we haven't done that. We are, working with some of the people who are involved in City Deals. But no, we haven't done any work to actually evaluate the impact. There is a bit of a question about the different City Deals and the assumptions on the benefits to the economy that they will all bring to all parts of Scotland, and how much of that will happen, or how much of it might be displacement from other parts of Scotland. I think that's quite an interesting question, which I have.
We've touched on this already. To grow the economy and to grow tax, revenues, it seems that we need to be very careful about our capital investment and ensure that we're getting the biggest possible impact for the economy on that capital investment. More widely, on a Scottish level, looking at the Scottish Government's resources, is there any evidence so far that the significant investment that's been made in capital is having the desired impact on the Scottish economy, growing the Scottish economy and growing revenues?
In terms of investment, there's been pretty poor data over the last couple of years on business investment in general, which obviously public investment is very important too, but business investment has been very subdued over the last couple of years, which will undoubtedly be having an impact on the economy. I haven't seen much evidence so far about the impact of investment and on economic growth, but a lot of that will be seen in future years. These projects have a long lead-in time, and therefore may take a while to come through in the figures.
And in terms of Scottish Government's capital investment, is there any analysis of how that could be spent more effectively? Like, is there other, we've got a huge billions of pounds spent on capital infrastructure projects in different areas. Is there any analysis done on how, if we were to spend it in different projects in different ways on different sectors, that would potentially result in a more positive impact for the economy?
Well, I guess a couple of things on that. I guess it depends what you're trying to achieve. If you have these wider goals rather than simply, GVA.
It's revenues and grow the economy. So that's the goal. In terms of the pure economic modelling perspective of it, when you're modelling how much of an impact this will have, the more local your supply chain is, the bigger the impact it has on the Scottish economy. Obviously, when you're looking at things like construction projects, it has a certain level of import propensity, both from the rest of the UK and the rest of the world. And if you're importing things from outside of Scotland, then you're not getting supply chain impacts. So that's one of the biggest issues in terms of the actual impact on the Scottish economy. If you're purely looking at the sort of GVA or employment impacts of a particular project.
Okay. I think we're moving slightly away from the focus on budget, but Alexander, I think you wanted to ask some questions about local government budget.
Thank you very much, Kavir. Local government has seen a nearly 8% reduction in funding since 2013. You've correctly identified some areas have been hit harder than others, such as maintenance. This is an area particularly pertinent up in Aberdeenshire, which is seeing bridges being closed. And on page 70, you discuss the analysis of these effects. And so my question is, do you do any economic analysis of both the short-term economic effects or the long-term costs that are building up?
We haven't done any economic analysis of the long-term economic effects of this cut in local government funding, no.
But this failure to maintain assets is going to lead to greater costs in the future. How are we accounting for that? And if we're not recording or dealing with that depreciation accurately, how accurate are these forecasts we're basing our budgets on?
In terms of the economic growth in Scotland?
Well, both. We can all see things like whether it's potholes or bridges closing or that kind of effect. We can see that happening, but when it actually goes wrong, the additional cost or loss of tax revenue and all the rest of it suddenly is like a cliff edge. When a bridge closes, it's suddenly a massive thing. But you don't see when you're not maintaining something every year and then it goes wrong, it's actually a bigger cost to deal with. Where are we providing for that? And if we're not providing for that, is that a bit of work that should be being done? And if it's not being provided for, how accurate are these budgets? These forecasts in terms of revenue?
Okay. Well, I think that sort of modelling is difficult to do, and it's not our area of expertise because a lot of that is around transport links and the loss and things like productivity. The disruption you have if a bridge is closed, or the potential for road closures or other things if more significant maintenance is required. We haven't done any work on that, but I agree it would be an interesting thing to look into.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. John.
Hey, thanks very much, Convener. I think I had a few points in your report that I wanted to touch on that maybe haven't been touched on so far, so if that's okay. The first one was around pages 28, 29, income tax and the concept of behavioural change. And sometimes people think of that as like moving around the place, but there's also this whole concept of incorporation, which you touch on, that a sole trader has the options of, well, might have the option of being an employee, being a self-employed, or a partnership, and then or being a limited company. And you say, well, there's things kind of going in both directions, I think, because you're suggesting that it might be preferable to be a limited company, especially if corporation tax falls. But on the other hand, HMRC have been doing some work on trying to make sure that people who are really employed are really employed. Can you just expand on that a little bit? And is there a trend in that overall?
So, the overall trend, as I understand it, of tax-motivated incorporation, as it's catchily termed, is that it has been increasing, which is one of the reasons why I think HMRC have looked to bring in the IR35 regulations to try and stop disguised employment. It will mean that it may mean that the trend in tax-motivated incorporation is somewhat reversed, but that's sort of yet to be seen. I suppose the important thing for Scotland and the tax base and the implications for the budget is whether this is happening at different rate to the rest of the UK, rather than just if it's just that it's happening. It's more, is it happening at the same rate or not? Because obviously, if this reduces the Scottish tax base by a certain percentage, if it's happening at the same rate in the rest of the UK, then we have no net overall impact. Similarly, if the IR35 regulations mean that the trend is reversed and more people come into the employed population than were there before, again, as long as that's happening at the same rate as the rest of the UK, there'll be no net overall impact. So the question is really whether the different tax regime in Scotland has a differential impact on people and their incentive to incorporate, and whether that's now wiped out by the IR35 regulations. I think that's sort of yet to be seen, and to be honest, it's HMRC who takes the lead on the analysis for that. Although my understanding is that they work very closely with the Fiscal Commission, and then building in their assumptions about tax-motivated incorporation in Scotland.
My gut feeling had always been that, if you were 2% different from the UK in tax rates and things, it wouldn't make much of an impact, but obviously once it gets bigger, it might. I mean, when do you think we might get an idea? Do we have to wait maybe 5 years to see to kind of analyse all this?
I think we'll need the 18-19 and probably a couple of years after that, survey of personal incomes data, the detailed microdata where we can analyse the changes in the distribution of taxpayers and that sort of thing. We'll need the data that HMRC have been collecting on tax-motivated incorporations over that period. But just to sort of manage expectations, even then it's quite difficult to know exactly how people have responded because we don't have the counterfactual. We don't have what their behaviour would have been had these two different tax regimes not been in place. So there is work that can be done, research that can be done after a few years of these tax changes to both hypothesise and try and evidence from the literature what the effects have been. But it isn't easy, and it isn't, just like we can do a calculation and get the answer because we don't have the alternative reality of these tax changes not having actually happened.
Okay, that's helpful, thanks. My second issue was VAT, which you touch on round about page 32, and the fact that a VAT assignment has hit practical problems, I think, would be fair to say, would it? I'm wondering, could Brexit or does Brexit have an impact on this in that it was the EU, I think, that insisted on the same VAT rates throughout the UK? And therefore, if we're not in the EU, does that allow us, we could actually move VAT around in Scotland? And I mean, maybe this is unfair, but do you think there's any prospect of getting a system in place that the VAT can be broken down as to where it's all coming from?
I think it's really difficult. Early in the process, it was agreed between the two governments that there would be a sort of modelled approach to try and estimate VAT based on consumption in different parts of the UK, which did make sense given that obviously it's a consumption tax. But in the end, it looks like the data that is relied upon to do that is just not sort of good enough quality to give the assurance of fluctuations in the budget, which aren't just about statistical variability. In terms of having a different system, any system which required, for example, businesses to break up their VAT returns between different parts of the UK would obviously have significant implications for businesses. So I guess it would be whether it was sort of, I guess, worth it to increase the burden on business in order to have that information about VAT receipts raised in Scotland.
What you'd have to do, because I mean, my hope had always been if we attracted a factory to Scotland, that factory adds value, and there would be a VAT implication. But if we're only looking at where the consumer spends at the end of the day, in a sense, it doesn't matter where the factory is. So there's no advantage in us in winning that factory. Yes,
because ultimately that liability does rest with the consumer because they pay it in the end. So yes, I can see your point. But that's a very complex tax, and whether it would actually sort of reflect that factory being in a particular part of the country in terms of VAT receipts, sort of not necessarily.
Okay, I'll leave that one. That's fine, thanks. The next one is this concept with HMRC of real-time information. Now that's touched on, I think, pages 52, 53 in your report. Now, if I'm understanding this correctly, some of the forecasts for the future are kind of pessimistic about Scottish revenues, but the RTI seems to, suggests on the contrary, this may be somewhat pessimistic outlook, so it seems to be giving a slightly more positive angle. But then on the other hand, it says there are some important caveats. The SFC is cautious about reading too much into the RTI data. Who do we trust in this?
I think, to be honest, the Fiscal Commission have a point here. If you look at their statement of data needs, for example, that they published in September, they show some of the different messages that are given between the actual outturn data for between 17-18 and 16-17, and what the RTI data seems to be implying, and the messages are quite different. Okay, yes, there's growth in both of those, as you would expect, but the growth rates are quite different. So what they've done is called on HMRC to help them understand the differences between these sets of statistics. They say quite clearly in the RTI publication that it is not the same as outturn data, and for various reasons about high income child benefit charges and tax code changes and lots of different reasons why RTI will not necessarily correlate well with outturn data.
Like a kind of cash flow situation, it's the actual cash that's coming in?
It's the POE sort of coming in, and then I'm not an expert on the details of exactly how it's then estimated for Scotland, to be honest. But there are various differences that they sort of put out. That you cannot assume these are the same as outturn data, but at the same time, it's the most timely source of information that the forecasters have to base their judgments on. So it's not really good enough for HMRC to put these out there and then say, oh, but you can't assume they're the same as outturn data. I think I would agree with the SFC that HMRC have this data and have all the data in their hands, and so I think it is up to them to kind of explain what one can draw from the RTI data and what one can't and why. I do think it's the onus should be put on HMRC to explain that more thoroughly.
Okay, thank you. And the final area I wanted to just ask you about was you talk about on page 72 the review of the fiscal framework going forward, which I think is 2022 or thereabouts. And you say it should ideally take place much more transparently than was the case for the negotiation of the 2016 framework. I suppose my question is that actually possible? I mean, the two governments, to some extent, fudged something in 2016, but the two parliaments, I mean, at Westminster and ourselves, want to be scrutinising these things and how they're done. And you've already said this, we've ended up with an incredibly complex situation. I think the OECD said it was one of the most complex in the world. Yeah. So could you, again, expand a little bit where you think we could be more, it could be done better?
Well, I guess we've got the benefit now of the practicalities of actually operating this. I mean, I think taking the views of the various organisations that have been involved in the fiscal framework in a an open way is obviously part of the review, or it should be. And talking to the forecasting organisations, the governments, the commentators, who've had to explain the complexities of the fiscal framework and, frankly, some of the unintended consequences that have come out as a result of the fiscal framework, is a helpful part of the process. I think, look, we understand that some of this will be obviously it'll be a political negotiation in the end to come up with the new solution. But I think it's important, as you say, that the two parliaments have, an involvement in this and have confidence that the ultimate decision was evidence-based and a fair settlement.
I think my very final point then, there seems to be, and it's come through in a lot of things you made, it's based on our comparison between how the Scottish economy does, how Scottish taxpayers pay tax, all that, with how the rest of the UK does. So we might do quite well or we might do quite badly, but the key thing is how we compare. And when we compare with the UK, we end up comparing with London, because London is often out of line with the rest of England. So are we always at a disadvantage because we're trying to compete with London?
Well, I mean, it's certainly true that when you look at things like, if you're comparing Scotland with the UK, and you look at historic growth rates, over 50 years, that generally Scotland has lagged slightly behind the UK growth rate, for example. But yes, quite a lot of that will be driven by London. Some of that's about population, though, and so that risk, to a certain extent, is dealt with in the current mechanism for the block grant adjustments. But yes, different parts of the UK grow at different rates.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Would it be fair, perhaps, for the benefit of hindsight, to say that the fiscal framework that was agreed through the Smith Commission is a pretty bad deal for Scotland?
No, I don't. I certainly wouldn't want to say that. No, I think there have been unforeseen consequences. I think there were perhaps expectations of things like, for example, the forecast errors on the block grant adjustments and the tax receipts going in the same direction, which weren't reasonable at the time, which have now been shown not to be reasonable. And hopefully, with the benefit of hindsight, these can be built into any future fiscal framework. I don't think that's fair to say. I guess one of the consequences of as fiscal devolution is taking on more risk, and it's whether that risk is acceptable or you have the levers to manage that in a successful way.
Can I ask then, in terms of the budget, I'm always quite interested in joined up government or the lack of joined up government that takes place at every level of government. But you say that the local government funding has been disproportionately cut since 2010. Now, there are tens of thousands of jobs disappeared in local government as a result of those cuts that have taken place over that period of time. So is it as a result of budget decisions there are less people in the economy paying tax, etc.? I'm interested in how all these decisions have knock-on effect, and how is the government looking at the impact of decisions in some parts of its budget for other parts of its budgets?
It's a really great question. I mean, I don't have the figures for local government employment, for example, in front of me. But I mean, if we look overall, between 1617 and 1920, you know, resource spending has increased by over £1 billion in real terms. But the majority of that has gone to the health budget. Another big chunk is for sort of social security and employability responsibilities. And so spending on non-health, non-social security has fallen over that period. And it's local government that's taken the biggest hit. And other bits like higher education, universities have also taken a hit. So yes, you have seen a real change in the profile of spending. And I suppose it's for the committees in the Parliament to say whether that's a sensible reprofiling of the budget or not.
Is there a judgment to be made? So the more that in this Parliament we have greater powers, is there a judgment to be made around how you actually use the budget to drive the economy, to stimulate the economy? And is that not a criticism that could be made? So taking tens of thousands of jobs out of local government was not in the best interest of the wider economy, or local economies for that matter. Take the skills shortages that seem to exist in most key sectors of the Scottish economy. So even as Neil was talking about capital investment, you have major capital programmes, but what you find is that you've not got the skills in this country, and therefore you're having to import those skills. So the level of spend in this country benefiting from all these things. I'm just trying to think how this budget's joined up, and is there a real focus on trying to stimulate and grow the economy in order to make the budget more healthier in future years?
I mean, it's a great question, and I suppose it kind of builds on what Patrick was saying earlier about what you're trying to achieve through the budget and what the priorities are, and whether what's money spent on is having an effect on those priorities. I don't think I'm really answering your question, but
Final point, I heard on the radio this morning, it was the deputy leader of Inverclyde. Sadly, Greenock is now being, well, thankfully Fergusley Park's come up a bit, but Greenock's town centre is now the poorest area in the country. And he was talking about the council have plans for £3 million in investment into Greenock town centre, but when he was asked by the interviewer what is the main thing that can happen, he said an end to austerity. And I thought that was quite stark. Where are we at with austerity and the impact of austerity? Because again, if you're looking at the wider economy, austerity arguably has failed in terms that the economy has not grown, and we're in greater debt than we were before the austerity was introduced.
well, the definition of austerity is obviously debatable. I mean, I think in terms of the overall position of the budget, this in the block grant, this definitely seems to be a step change in terms of what's likely to come for the budget we're about to set. But it's obviously for the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament to decide where it then spends that money that it's given and the priorities it has. So.
Thank you very much, Mary. It's been a really helpful set of contributions this morning. You've given us lots to think about, and we're grateful to you. Thank you. And I close this public part of this meeting.